Yo, you guys, what's up? This is your girl Dragon. It's time for another Fortnite creative tutorial. This tutorial request is coming from the creative block from member Dre. He wanted me to make an update to my voting system, and we're going to be doing this update with the new voting group options device. So this system is super simple to set up compared to the last system that you guys have or probably have seen in my last tutorial. If you haven't checked it out, the link will be posted down below, so be sure to check it out if you like. Let me go ahead and run you guys a test so we can see what we're building here. And then I'm going to go through how it works, the devices you need, and some key benefits, and we'll go into the settings. So let's go ahead and check it out. All right, players get 30 seconds to make a vote. So let's say a player votes, they're going to be switched to a class, a voting class. And this class will allow them not to vote again. So second player votes, we have a 1-to-1, but you can see I cannot vote again. I can only vote one time. Now when the timer runs out, it's going to check the votes. And if it's a tie, it's going to start right over, right? Allowing players to vote again. All right, so that's going to reset. Right, there we go. Now we can vote again. All right, so the time's going to go down again, and once an option has the most votes, that option is going to be granted to all the players. Like so. All right, very simple setup, and you'll just see how cool this is and how this makes your life easier to do. So let me just go ahead and end that play test here. And let's break down how it works. All right, players spawn in with a default class of no class, and when they vote one time, they're switched to a voted class. This prevents duplicate votes. And what that does is the switches are set to a particular class. Only that class can activate the switch. So the default class is the class that can activate the switch. Once they vote, they're switched to a voted class, and since they're a new class, they're no longer the default class, they can no longer activate the switch. This is really great because it prevents duplicate votes. Now the players are given 30 seconds to vote on a loadout. If the votes result in a tie, all players are switched back to the default class and the voting process starts over. Players must vote again. The loadout with the most votes wins and the voting process ends. Now for the setup, you're going to need one voting group device, and that's going to manage all of your options. And you can see in this tutorial I have only 3 options. You're going to need 3 voting option devices, 3 switch devices, 3 score manager devices, 3 item granters, 9 item placers, 1 timer device, 2 class selectors, 1 mutator zone, and 1 HUD message device. Of course, if you're going to have 4 options, then you're going to want to have 4 switch devices, 4 score managers, 4 item granters, and 12 item placers. All right, and so forth. All right, so make sure you make that adjustment if you need more options for your players. Now here's some key benefits for the system. Definitely less devices used compared to the old system before we had the voting group option device. So this is really beneficial because this voting group option device automatically counts majority votes. You can also call specific events when voting ends or if there's a tie. And this can be easily created in verse to further customize. So really cool, flexible system, and you know, get you guys going really quick and easy. Now let's go through the settings. Now I do have an event called when the players spawn into the game using the player spawner pad. I'm going to give you some options here. You can call the events when the game starts using a round settings device if you prefer to do that instead. So keep that in mind. You can also use a channel device, and call that device or call that event upon each player spawning into the game. So it just depends on what your setup is. So I have an event that is set to the team 1, player team 1 spawn pad. So the first player who spawns into the game is always assigned to team 1. So they're going to be starting some events upon spawning. They're going to start the voting group loadout. They're going to begin the vote when receiving from. And then they're also going to enable all of the voting option devices. So you see option 1, 2, and 3. And all the other player spawn pads, you see there's nothing there. It's just set to the team. Now, if your players are spawning in and they're not automatically assigned to a team, then you can just put this team any, okay? Just a quick note. All right. Next, we're going to check out the voting group device. So the name of my voting group is called Loadout Vote. You can put any ID name you want here. So be sure that the name that you put here is also connected to your options device. So the spelling and everything has to be the same. You can see voting group here, loadout vote, has to be the same. So that's really important. If it's all lowercase, then make sure your voting group ID is all lowercase for all of your voting option devices, okay? And so forth. Now, we only want 1 vote per player, and it's set to a time limit of 30 seconds. Allow vote switching is on, however, you can have that off if you like. I have it on, however, it doesn't matter because once they vote once, they're switched to a different class and they cannot vote again. For functions, we're going to begin the vote when receiving from the player spawner pad, which should automatically be linked when the players spawn into the game. We're also going to begin the vote when the class switches back. This is after there's a tie. So when there's a tie, when the class is switched back to the starting class, we're going to start this voting process again. We're going to end the vote when receiving from the timer device on success. For events, when the vote is tied, we're going to start the timer device or reset the timer device. So reset and start the timer device. We're going to turn off all the switches, right? So switch 1 is turned off. The score manager is reset. Switch 2 is turned off. That's for loadout 2. And let's see here, the mutator zone is enabled. This will switch the players back to the start class. The score manager for loadout 2 is also reset. The score manager for loadout 3 is reset. The switch for loadout 3 is turned off. The class selector for the start class will change the player to class. And HUD message will show that it's a tie. All right, next, the HUD message device. This will only show when there's a tie. So I said, it's a tie, please revote. It's going to show it to all of the recipients in the map. It's only going to display for 4 seconds, and it is marked for a timed duration. And everything else is personal choice. Let's go down to our up to functions. You're going to show and receiving from voting group loadout on vote tied. So this will be, again, whatever you named your voting group device. Okay, so there we go. All right, next, what's important is each voting set consists of 1 switch button, 3 item placers, a score manager, and you can see behind here a voting option device and an item granter. Okay, so each of these sets are great. Once you set up it once, you can practically copy and paste, like duplicate it over and rename everything and just make sure everything's linked up appropriately. Meaning like make sure your option device is linked up to your switch and so forth, to the correct switch, and just make sure everything's good and so forth. So once you set it up well the first time, in Creative 1.0 you have that option, as well as in Uefn, to just copy and duplicate the system, because they'll all be still connected to the main group. So let's check out the switch device for loadout 1. Now you do notice I do have a state reset time of 30 seconds for this, and that way it automatically resets after the timer. We are going to store the state per player, and what this does is each player has their own switch state, so when they turn it on they see that it's on for them, but the other players don't see that the other player turned it on. So let's say for example I turn this on, then player 2 won't see that it's on for me. It'll show off for them, and then when they turn it on it'll show on for them, and so forth. For functions, we're going to turn off when receiving from the voting group loadout when the vote is tied. And then on turned on, we're going to send an event to the score manager that's connected to loadout 1 to increment. And it's going to increment by 1. We're also going to send an event to the voting option for loadout 1 to cast the vote when receiving from. All right, easy peasy. And then here you have your item placers. Again, you make sure you're going to put your loadout that's connected with your item granters here. And then let's check out the score manager for loadout 1. All right, we've got a score value of 0. We're going to add that score award type and so forth. We're going to reset when receiving from voting group loadout when the vote is tied. We're going to increment when receiving from switch loadout 1 on turned on. And there you go. All right, and then item granter. For functions, we're going to grant item when receiving from the trigger. On trigger, now this actually can be removed because I had initially set this up with the triggers and I realized, hey, let's just use the voting group option devices. So grant when receiving from the voting option loadout 1 on vote completed winner. All right, there you go. And then voting option loadout 1. Again, it is connected to the ID that was placed on the voting group device. And then the option text is vote. We're going to enable when receiving from when the first player in the game spawns into the game. We're going to cast the vote when receiving from the switch for loadout 1 when it's turned on. Then for events on voting option selected, we're going to send the event to the class selector voted class. We're going to change player to class. And this is going to change them to the voted class, allowing them not to select again. On voted completed winner, we're going to send an event to the item granter to grant everyone the items for this loadout. All right, cool. That completes this set. Now you'll see that each set going forth is practically the same. It's just connected to its specific item granter. So let's check it out. Again, I'm going to remove that trigger because we're using the voting group option devices. All right, cool. And let me just double check this one to ensure that the trigger is also not there. All right, I notice here that I need to add that class selector here. And change them to the voted class. All right, there we go. So this is connected to Score Manager for loadout 2, voting option for loadout 2, and then you're going to change the player to the voted class once they press the switch button. All right, and this, just going back, you see the same events except it's connected to Score Manager loadout 1. We're going to increment voting option loadout 1 and then change the player to the voted class once they, press that button. All right, cool. Next, we're going to go to the Score Manager. All right, and then let's go to item granter for loadout 2. Again, removing the trigger. And only receiving from, grant item when receiving from voting loadout 2 for that voting option loadout 2 when the vote is a completed winner, right? And then voting option, again, is connected to that main group. Cast vote when receiving from switch for loadout 2 when it's turned on. And on voting option selected, we're going to send an event to class selector, voted class, change player to class. On vote completed winner, send event to item granter. Loadout 2, we're going to grant all the items to all the players. All right, let's check out the next set for 3. And of course, I got to probably make some updates here. I'm going to remove the trigger. All right. right, and then score manager for loadout 3. And again, I'm going to remove that trigger. So if you need to see that one more time. All right, cool. And then let's check out the item granter for loadout 3. All right, cool. And then voting option for loadout 3. Let me go ahead and add a 3 here. There we go. Cool. All right. Next, let's check out the class selector devices. So you see I have 2 class selectors, one for the voted class and one for the start class. So let's check out the start class. And this is set to class to switch to no class. And change player to class when receiving from the mutator zone device when the player entering zone. And voting group loadout on vote tide. On class switch, we're going to send an event to voting group loadout to begin the vote when receiving from, and this will restart the entire process for the voting process. And we're going to also disable the mutator zone once that process starts. All right, when players vote and they go ahead and select a loadout by pressing the switch and turning it on, they're going to be switched to the voted class. So I'm using class 254 here. Make sure you use a class that is suitable for your mechanic setup. And make sure that that class is available and does not coincide with any additional classes that you have within your system. All right, change player to class when receiving from switch 3 when turned on, switch 2 when turned on, voting option load out on voting option selected. This is 3. Voting option loadout 2 when voting option selected, and voting option loadout 1 on voting option selected. We're also going to turn it on switch loadout 1 when it's turned on. So you have all 3 switches and all 3 voting options. All right, next the mutator zone. And I believe this is, oh, and then we still got to do the timer. So it is enabled on phase none. And you see I have it, it's not like covering the entire area, only the player's feet. It's covered. Now the only option here is if the player jumps at the same time, the timer goes out. That might be a problem. So let's go ahead and just make it bigger. All right, there we go. That way. And let's go ahead and increase the height. And let's see, it's not, let me make the height a little bit smaller. Let's try that. All right, that's good. Just making sure it covers the entire area. All right, so let's check it out. And again, everything from here on is personal preference, but since this is only being turned on and off at the time that it's a tie, then there's no need to, turn off the building. Now, you can if you want to. You could put this to no, just for, just keep things safe. Just like that. All right, for functions, we're going to disable when receiving from the class selector, start class when the class is switched. We're going to enable when receiving from the voting group loadout when it's tied. On events, when the player is entering the zone or if they're within the zone, the timer device is going to start and the class selector, start class, will change the player to class. All right, and then the timer, which is our last device. There we go. So this is set for a duration of 30 seconds and it will start as soon as the game starts. However, if you need a buffer, let's say you want it to start upon another event, then turn that off, and within your events tab or your functions tab, you're going to, send that event when you feel it's more appropriate. All right, for functions, we're going to start when receiving from voting group loadout when the vote is tied. So we're basically restarting this timer. And then mutator zone device on player entering zone. Reset when receiving from on vote tied. Again, when the voting group is tied, we want to reset the timer and start it again. For events, when it's successful, we're going to send an event to the voting group loadout device to end the vote and end the entire process. And there you go. Now another thing you can do actually, if you want to, let's say when voting ends, you could just stop the timer, or you can send an event to teleport the players to another area. And you can see that a lot in a lot of games now and then, that once they select their weapons and everyone has their weapons, then they're teleported to either their team area or another area to play. So I'm going to leave that as a challenge for you guys to go ahead and figure out when is the appropriate time to set that up. Could it be maybe you start a buffer timer as soon as this ends and it's a successful vote, right? So you have a successful vote and there's a win, right? Then you start another timer to enable a mutator zone that will teleport all players to a specific area. The second challenge I want to give you guys is adding a fourth loadout system. It's as simple as duplicating and updating the names and making sure everything is binded as shown, and you should be good to go. All right, that concludes this tutorial. Let's go ahead and run another playtest just to see what we built. All right, so we have a tie, it's a 1-to-1, and you can see I cannot vote again. So we have to wait until the timer runs out, giving everyone enough time to vote. All right, it's a tie, please revote. All right, so can we just do some explosives? Let's do that. again, what's great about this system is it's always going to count the majority vote within that option group. So that reduces a lot of devices that we usually would use in this case, which would be like a trigger device and so forth. Now we got our explosives and it's done, right? It's good as good, right? All right, cool. All right, so you guys see how that works. I do hope this helps you and helps you in building your own, voting system. I'm sure that you can implement this in a variety of ways, so it'll be great to see what you make. All right, you guys, thanks for chilling, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.